Good day. I'm going to commence this video today with an apology and a partial retraction. The apology and the partial retraction relates to the video which I posted yesterday and the section of it which related to the failure of a Russian crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River. Now, many of you may have seen various photos which have appeared of the damage, the destruction done to the Russian forces as a result of the failure to cross this river, the destroyed pontoon bridge, and the large number of Russian vehicles which were seen littered around the river on both sides of the river as a result of the failure of this river crossing. And I didn't discuss the photos in any detail in my program yesterday because I'm not somebody who is capable or has any real ability to analyze photos, and besides which, as I've said many times, I have eyesight problems which make it very difficult for me sometimes to examine photos or photographic evidence in any great detail. Nonetheless, it is the case that I was partially informed when I made that program by those photos, and that they did give me an idea of the scale, or at least what I believe to be the scale, of the Russian failure in this river crossing. Well, I am now much more skeptical. Firstly, I became skeptical yesterday when, reading a report from Reuters, I discovered that these photographs had apparently been published by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Allegedly, they come from Ukrainian drone footage of the area of the battle. Now, I have to say this, in these kind of conflicts, provenance is all, and when either side releases photographs, especially nowadays when it's extremely easy to distort photographs with all kinds of techniques which are beyond my technical ability to explain, but which undoubtedly do exist, when either side releases photographs, one always has to take them with a very considerable amount of skepticism. And that already made me a bit concerned about the photographs of this crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River, now that I discovered that they originated from Ukrainian government sources. Now, I'm also going to say that, unfortunately, it is also the case that Ukraine has provided misleading and false information at various times over the course of this war. The outstanding example, which even the Ukrainians now admit is untrue, is this fictitious individual, the Ghost of Kiev, the Ukrainian fighter pilot who supposedly by himself shot down 40 Russian aircraft. But there have been others. I mean, the surrender, or rather the decision of the Ukrainian border guards on Snake Island to fight to the death, for example, is another case in point. That particular claim collapsed when it turned out that all of these border guards had instead surrendered to the Russians and were alive and well in Sevastopol. Bizarrely, that story has never been completely retracted, even though the essential part of it, that these border guards refused to surrender but fought on, that has proved obviously to be untrue. But anyway, Ukraine does have a history of giving incorrect and sometimes outright false information about events, and that makes me doubly careful when I look at photographs like the ones of the Seversky Donetsk crossing, which it turns out originate from Ukraine. In addition, and I have to say this, over the course of the day, I've been reading various reports, and one of them has actually been sent to me directly by a person who appears to know a lot more about this sort of thing than me, that it's been impossible to geolocate precisely this crossing, and the analysis of the photograph suggests, or rather of the photographs, suggests that they may be a conflation of the failed Russian crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River, but also of a failed Ukrainian crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River that was taking place at roughly the same time. Now, about that attempted Ukrainian crossing, I've no doubt of that it was indeed attempted. There have been actually reports that the Ukrainians have been unsuccessfully trying to cross the Seversky Donetsk River in another part of the battlefield, further north. And there were reports, in fact, that the Ukrainians had made an attempt to cross the Seversky Donetsk River in this area on the same day that the Russians were attempting to cross the Seversky Donetsk in another part of the battlefield. So there was indeed a Ukrainian crossing, or at least attempted Ukrainian crossing, which appears to have failed. And there have been other such crossings as well, at least as unsuccessful attempts by Ukraine to cross the Seversky Donetsk River as well. So it seems to me that it is not intrinsically impossible that this is indeed a photograph or series of photographs that appear to conflate two completely different episodes with the intention of making the Russian losses over the course of this river crossing appear worse than they really were. Now, I must at this point make a number of qualifications. Firstly, I don't know that that is the case. I mean, I'm not, as I said, a person who's able to examine photographs in any detail. And the fact that the Ukrainians have provided false information in the past doesn't necessarily prove that they're providing false information on this occasion. As I said, I'm not somebody who can look at these photographs or conduct geolocation or do those kind of things and reach any definite or expert views on this subject. And the second point I have to make is that regardless of how heavy the Russian losses over the course of this attempted crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River actually were, everybody, including various people on the Russian side, accept that there was a failed attempt by the Russians to cross the Seversky Donetsk River, and that the Russians did take significant losses over the course of that attempt. So this is a qualified retraction, and I want to make that clear. I still don't know the full facts, but certainly they don't look quite as clear-cut as I may have suggested, as I did suggest in my program yesterday. What makes this all really rather curious is that I'm now getting some reports, which I want to stress at the moment are heavily unconfirmed, that the Russians have indeed now managed to cross the Seversky Donetsk River in roughly the location where they were trying to cross the river in the first place. So, it may be that this is a more complex story than appeared, that this was an initial attempt, that the Russian losses weren't as heavy as were reported or as the photographic footage released by the Ukrainians suggested, and it may be that the Russians have now successfully carried out that river crossing after the initial failed attempt. Or it could be that the Ukrainian story is true. I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. However, what is confirmed is that elsewhere on the battlefield, at least in Donbass, things continue to go the Russians' way. There's more reports all the time of more settlements being captured, more East Ukrainian settlements, more Donbass settlements being captured by the Russians and their allied forces from the Ukrainians. And there are even reports that the Russians and the allied forces are actually now planning to storm Severodonetsk itself. In other words, to actually drive into the city, do much what they did in Mariupol. In other words, capture the city through hand-to-hand fighting. So that seems to be the situation in northern Donbass, at least. And it may explain, by the way, why the Ukrainian defense minister has spoken about Ukraine expecting dark times over the next few weeks, though Ukraine is still holding out the possibility that its forces may go on some counteroffensive in late August after Western weapons start to arrive in quantity. Whether that's ever actually going to happen is, of course, another matter. Meanwhile, on the topic of Ukraine and of the Ukrainian side of the war, I'm just going to make one very brief observation, which is that the Russians seem to be remarkably well informed about the internal discussions of the Ukrainian General Staff, or so you might think from some of the bulletins that the Russians have published, and also some of the commentaries that you see from various apparently well-informed and well-connected Russian sources. They seem to have a great deal of insight into what the Ukrainian General Staff is planning. So, for example, I read yesterday of Ukrainian plans to launch a counteroffensive to try and recapture the western side of the Dnieper River, in the area around Kherson, a counteroffensive which is supposed to involve 15,000 troops. I do wonder exactly how the Russians are supposed to get this information. And of course, the Russian Defense Ministry itself claimed a few days ago, following the battle at Snake Island, that there'd been dissension between President Zelensky and the Ukrainian General Staff, with the Ukrainian General Staff opposing the operation, but Zelensky insisting on it. Of course, that could all be Russian disinformation. It could be intended to feed doubts amongst Ukrainians about the unity of their leadership. I'm not going to speculate or make further guesses, or I don't know. It could be that the Russians have spies inside the General Staff. That wouldn't surprise me. Or it could be that they've broken into its communication systems. That wouldn't surprise me either. Or it could be, as I said, that they're making it all up and that this is pure disinformation from the Russian side. Speaking of the Russian side, and going back to the Seversky Donetsk affair, in any other conflict situation, one would assume that if those photographs that the Ukrainians had published of the Seversky Donetsk crossing were indeed manipulated, or in some cases outright fakes, that the Russian Defense Ministry would be rushing out to say as much. In fact, one of the extraordinary features of this war is that the Russians don't do that. They do provide daily bulletins, but those bulletins are incredibly sparse. They provide concise accounts of certain battles, like the Snake Island battle, but mainly they are primarily devoted to a catalogue of missile strikes on Ukrainian facilities up and across Ukraine, without very much commentary. And one thing that the Russians never do is that they never rebut or go out of their way to rebut Ukrainian stories. So, for example, the Russian Defense Ministry has never commented on the alleged or the claimed or the much publicized Ukrainian offensive northeast of Kharkiv, for example. There's not been a single admission from the Russian Defense Ministry that Russian troops have pulled out of that area or what exactly happened there. And on the events in the Seversky Donetsk River, there's been no comment from the Russians at all. In fact, the Russian Defense Ministry provides only incredibly sparse accounts of what's happening in Donbass at all. They do from time to time publish information about a particular town or settlement having been captured by Russian and Allied forces. They mentioned, for example, the capture of Popasnaya. They've confirmed that other places from time to time have been captured by the Russians too, but they say, in fact, incredibly little about the state of the battle. Now, this must be an intentional policy, but of course it does mean that Ukrainian stories, Ukrainian accounts of events, like the Ukrainian account of the crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River, go around unchallenged. Now, why this is the case, why the Russians adopt this approach, I'm not really sure. I presume it has its history deep in Russian and Soviet military traditions, which is to say as little as possible about the conduct of operations in order to keep the other side guessing and at the same time to refuse to engage in an information war. I have to say that though at a military level that might make sense, at an information war level it does suggest again that the Russians have abdicated from the information war, despite the effect that the information war does have on the morale of both sides. So it's perhaps not an especially wise policy, at least not from my point of view, but there it is. It's the approach that the Russians are taking. Anyway, let's now move on to political news. The first thing to say is that it turns out that at the same time that Olaf Scholz was talking to President Putin, General Austin, the US Defense Secretary, was talking to the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. Now, the US has been trying to arrange a conversation with Shoigu, a telephone conversation between Shoigu and Austin for months, ever since the war started, and the Russians have consistently refused refused to agree to such calls. And what we understand is that this particular call, this particular conversation in which Austin asked Shoigu for a ceasefire, in Ukraine, which apparently Shoigu rejected, that this was the first such call, and there's been some speculation as to why the Russians agreed to it at this time. I'm going to offer my own 2 cents worth, which is that the Russians have agreed to this call now for 2 reasons. Firstly, the obvious one, that Mr. Shoigu has been an exceptionally busy man over the last few weeks and has probably not had much time to take telephone calls, especially with the US Defense Secretary. And secondly, that the Russians did not want to be pressed or questioned in any detail by the Americans on the conduct of military operations. Probably they now feel that with the situation in Donbass having settled into a war of attrition, and with it being fairly clear what's going on, that doesn't really apply anymore, so they decided to risk a call. It could also be that the Russians are sensing that things are beginning to shift, that the mood in the West is now turning against sanctions, with the discussions apparently going on about dropping the idea of oil sanctions against Russia and things of that sort. And it may be that it's the Russians now who want to hear more what the Americans are going to say to them than that the Russians have anything very much to say. Certainly, that seems to have been the case in the Scholz-Putin conversation. Now, that conversation apparently lasted for 70 minutes, which may make it the longest conversation that Putin and Scholz have had with each other, though I'm not definitely saying that is the case. But anyway, the Russians have provided, as they always do, a fairly brief summary readout of what happened with Putin complaining about Ukrainian war crimes, complaining about alleged war crimes, complaining about the lack of progress in the negotiations, and apparently willing to some extent to touch on food security issues. But the Germans have provided a rather different, or rather more detailed view of what was discussed. And it's quite interesting because this time it comes from the German spokesman, and we read the German government spokesman, Stefan Heberstreit, said that given the serious military situation and the consequences of the war in Ukraine, especially in Mariupol, the Chancellor insisted on the soonest ceasefire, an improvement of the humanitarian situation, and progress in the search for a diplomatic solution to the conflict in the conversation with the Russian president. The Chancellor and the Russian president also spoke about the global food situation. Heberstreit said Scholz pointed out the special responsibility for Russia, given the tense food situation that had emerged in the context of the events in Ukraine. That's quite interesting. First of all, let's talk about Mariupol. There has been a massive, an extraordinary effort over the last week or so to get the Russians to agree to exchange or release the Ukrainian fighters who are trapped in the Azovstal factory. Now, I have to say that this does somewhat surprise me, and I wonder quite why it's going on to the extent that it is, but going on it does seem to be. Now, I haven't talked about Azovstal very much recently in recent videos. It does seem as if all the civilians are indeed out of the factory. It does also seem as if the Russians and their allied troops have been bombing and shelling the factory extensively. And it does also seem as if the Russians and allied troops have been gradually, incrementally capturing more and more parts of the factory, though it's clear that there's been no outright attempt to storm the factory, or at least what's left of the factory. Instead, one gets very much the impression that the Russian policy is to starve the Ukrainian troops out. That's a rather callous way of putting it, but basically to wait until these troops give up, surrender, when they run out of supplies of food and ammunition, when they're no longer capable of resisting anymore. It seems that the Russians are not interested in letting these people go. Well, that is interesting because elsewhere, the Ukrainians seem to be redoubling their efforts to get these troops in Azovstal released. And we see that there's been attempts by other governments, and Scholz seems to have been one leader of one such government, to try to get the Russians to relent on the status, on the position of these Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal factory. And this continues the pattern that we saw earlier in the war, with Ukrainian attempts, repeated Ukrainian attempts to send helicopters and ships to Mariupol to try to evacuate these people. And one again has to ask, what is so important about these people that the Ukrainians are making this huge effort to rescue them? Now, there's lots of speculation about Westerners, Western fighters being there, Western mercenaries, as the Russians claim. There's various talks about senior Western officers being there. I don't know whether any of that is true, or it could be that these particular fighters from the Azov battalion or regiment somehow have enormous political pull in Kiev itself. It's a fact that now a trio of former Ukrainian presidents, Poroshenko, Kuchma and Yushchenko, have also now called for the negotiated release of these fighters. I suspect all that this is doing is confirming to the Russians how important it is for these fighters to be forced into outright surrender. So there we go. I don't think that the Russians are going to agree to these proposals. I don't see why they would. And I think that the fact that even the Chancellor of Germany appears now to be joining in these demands or requests for some kind of exchange of prisoners to now allow these fighters to be released, I think that that's going to harden the Russian belief that it is important to force these soldiers, not prisoners, to force these soldiers to surrender. Anyway, we'll see what happens. We'll see whether the Russians relent and agree to some sort of exchange, or whether, as I, on the contrary, rather expect, the Russians stand their ground and wait until we have a mass surrender of the remaining fighters in Mariupol, in the Azovstal factory. Anyway, for the rest, note that both Scholz and Austin have called for an immediate ceasefire, which is interesting. I mean, usually one would expect that it's the side that's losing to want a ceasefire, not the side that's winning. And that seems to contradict claims that it is Ukraine that is actually winning this war. But let's not put too much into that. It may be that Austin and Scholz are indeed trying to find a way of ending the suffering in Ukraine, though I think in that case, calls for a ceasefire and negotiated solutions might be better addressed to Zelensky rather than to Putin. But consider the other side. You see Scholz again talking about a diplomatic solution. Now that implies something less than the kind of capitulation that the British have been demanding, capitulation on the part of the Russians. Or it could be that Scholz is trying to find some way of bringing this conflict to an end, because he's starting to sense the way in which this conflict is causing massive problems in the world economy and specifically in the German economy. That is what I discussed yesterday. And I have to say that the comments of his spokesman have tended to strengthen that view. Note also the heavy comments, the heavy emphasis on the food crisis. Well, there is a food crisis. The war in Ukraine undoubtedly plays a role in it, a significant role in it. A resolution of the war in Ukraine would be the way to resolve that food crisis. The best way to do it, or so it seems to me, is through the negotiated settlement that the Russians have proposed and which we seem to be edging towards in Istanbul. Again, it does seem to me that Scholz would be better advised making these points to Zelensky. I'm guessing, by the way, that Putin made exactly that point to Scholz. After all, Putin, the Russian readout, talks about the fact that the talks were at a standstill because of the Ukrainian position, which suggests to me that Putin's response to all these demands from Scholz was that Scholz speak to Zelensky and get Zelensky to start to shift position. So it may very well be that things are going on, that Scholz is trying at last and finally to bring this crisis to some kind of an end, to see towards some form of de-escalation, because the crisis in the economy in Europe, in Germany in particular, but globally as well, the crisis involving surging food prices, surging energy crisis, is starting to take a massive toll of the world economy. But it's also clear that Scholz, precisely because he's addressing Putin, is not so far willing to do what would be needed to bring this conflict to that kind of end, which is to talk to Zelensky instead. Or perhaps he is. I'm not entirely certain. There's been an indication that Zelensky has himself made certain comments about the kind of way forward in the war. He's apparently recently spoken about the need for the fact that Ukraine is open to negotiations. And there's now reports that he's made certain further comments about what Ukraine might do, about Ukraine's red lines. He appears to have said, for example, that Ukraine will not recognize Crimea as part of Russia. It will not even grant autonomy to Donbass, to the two Donetsk and Lugansk republics, but that it might be prepared to negotiate about that later. So the very fact that Zelensky's saying these things might be a sign that somebody, perhaps the Germans, are telling him maybe it's time to actually sit down with the Russians and to go back to what was talked about in Istanbul. Maybe that's what the Germans are saying to Zelensky, or at least some of the Germans. Maybe it's what the French are saying. I don't know. It's interesting. It's curious that Scholz called Putin at this time. Regardless, it's clear that Putin, like Shoigu, didn't give an inch. Even the Germans admit that he didn't deviate from what his well-known positions on this conflict have always been. So who knows? Maybe we're starting to see the first glimmer that the European core, Germany and France, are starting to understand the trap they've walked themselves into. Maybe they're trying to find some way out. In the case of Germany, that's going to be incredibly difficult. I can't see how Scholz can do a U-turn now and start to put serious pressure on Ukraine without seeing the collapse of his government. And though, in theory, a new grand coalition between the SPD and the CDU-CSU to try and find some way out of this is possible, the CDU-CSU has itself taken an exceptionally strong line on Ukraine, in support of Ukraine, over the course of this conflict, and it might be difficult for them to do as well. However, the CDU-CSU obviously has to listen to its business and industrial backers, and it could be that they're busy phoning up the various people there, telling them that this all has to change and we have to get off this sanctions escalator too. I don't want to over-analyze or over-discuss this. It still seems to me as if at the moment, for the moment, the sanctions escalator is still in overdrive. I think that Scholz comes across to me as clumsy and perhaps not especially bright, is not the person to turn this round. And Macron, I suspect, is going to find himself in a similar difficulties. He's at least been speaking to Putin, but it doesn't seem to me as if he's been making much progress either. And he's still talking about escalating the sanctions war, even as that is becoming increasingly difficult for him. But who knows? Perhaps we're starting to see the first glimmers of doubt. I don't think the Russians are very impressed, but it may be that that's the reason why Shoigu and Putin agreed to listen, in part, to what the Western powers had to say. We'll wait and see. In the meantime, as I said, the fighting in Donbass, in Ukraine, continues. The war of attrition in Donbass continues. The Russians continue to grind the Ukrainian forces down. They seem to be preparing some kind of move against the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk grouping, which is now, to all intents and purposes, trapped, if they have indeed crossed the Seversky Donetsk River, as some of those earlier reports I was hearing confirm, then of course the position of the Ukrainian forces in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk will have become critical. And in the event that those forces are forced to surrender or are defeated, then it's not impossible that we could start to see a cascade effect with further Ukrainian retreats or surrenders across Donbass. Regardless, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see how things turn out. Let's see where the situation is going. In the meantime, on the economic front, there's been a fascinating admission from The Economist, one of the most stridently anti-Russian, anti-Putin, I should say, publications in Britain. I mean, The Economist absolutely loathes Putin, and anybody who's under any doubts about that should look at some of its covers. Anyway, there's been a fascinating admission from The Economist that the Russian economy is still standing, it's still resilient, it's proving to be much more resilient against sanctions pressure than anybody had imagined. And the very fact that The Economist is saying this at this time does suggest to me that the recognition is starting to spread in elite circles across the West that this economic war of attrition, which of course affects the political class, the position of the political class across the West, is now going to continue for much longer than any of them anticipated, with very difficult consequences for themselves, and that it's not going to end in the swift and clear-cut victory which they imagined. And if we are seeing some sort of attempts by people like Scholz and Austin to try and find some way out of this crisis, well, that's probably the reason why. Well, all very speculative today. I'm not sure what is in Scholz's mind or Austin's mind. It strikes me, by the way, that neither of these two people, with all respect to them, neither of them is the sharpest knife in the drawer. So perhaps they're certainly not the most supple of people to carry out negotiations. But regardless, we'll have to wait and see. The crisis in Ukraine continues as before. And as I said, I want to stress again that I don't want to overanalyze these events or imply that these calls between Scholz and Putin and between Austin and Shoigu are more important than they really are. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, on Rumble and Locals. If you go on Locals, you will be able to join our thriving community there. And if you become an active member, you can participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place every Wednesday at 1900 Eastern Standard Time. And of course, if you're watching this video on Rumble or indeed any Duran connected video, if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button, and that will also take you directly to our Locals homepage. But you can find us on other platforms too, on ODYSEE, and on the new free speech platform SuperU. And of course, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also, if you wish, you can support us, but also help yourself by coming to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, our bomber jackets, our sweatshirts, all sorts of amazing things. And last but not least, If you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.